Welcome back to this chess video, everyone. So today we will be talking about how to attack positionally. So in this game I begin with 1d4, pretty normal so far. My opponent also plays pretty common moves. They played knight f6, so that's alright. So far we're so good. So I play c4, they play e6, which is still pretty common stuff. And so I play knight c3, and if they were to play bishop to b4, this would be known as the Nimzo-Indian defense. Now, some people think that this is actually one of black's best openings that they can try against this kind of d4, c4, and this knight c3 kind of configuration here. This is also a very common setup for a lot of Queen's Gambit players, and so oftentimes someone will prepare something like this, like say this Nimzo-Indian defense, and this is supposed to be one of the best tries against white, because oftentimes they'll get doubled c-pawns when they capture on c3. Now, if you really wanted to avoid this, instead of playing knight c3, you could actually avoid the entire opening and play knight f3, which is the anti-Nimzo-Indian, with the point being that if they play this check, they're no longer doubling your pawns. You can just like block with something like bishop d2, and it's a completely different opening. But I do not fear that opening, and so I do play knight c3, because I don't fear the Nimzo-Indian. If they play it, that's alright. You know, we have some plans and what we can play. So they do actually go for this opening, which is still solid so far. And there's so many different good moves you could play here, as with many mainline openings. So there's knight f3, that's a common move. There's bishop g5, that's a move. You know, there's e3, the normal variation. Even f3 is a move. a3 is a move. Queen c2 is the classical. You know, there's so many, as with many openings, just like the Sicilian defense or the King's Indian defense. You know, there's many theoretical lines that they could go with. But here I play the normal variation, so I just play e3. And at this point in time, I don't mind if they double my pawns. Yes, that's a bit weak for me in some sense, because structurally this will be, you know, more or less a problem that I have to deal with. But on the flip side, they have given up their bishop, and that means that they've given up the bishop pair. So I have some compensation for this. It's just that the play will be a little bit different, you know, based on how the game proceeds. Now, we'll actually get into this a little bit later in the game, and we'll actually see what effect the bishop pair actually has down the road. So here they play an interesting move, which is they actually castle. And really, I think there's more or less two types of players who castle on move 4 in the Nimzo-Indian. So I think there's two players here. There's either your like really strong title player, possibly a GM, probably has some interesting prep for this, or your beginner that more or less is just going off opening principles and just wants to castle. There's very little in between, at least from my experience. Most people who are kind of intermediate range don't really play castling here. So already, you know, because my opponent is not a title player, I'm kind of suspecting maybe they're not super familiar with this opening, even if they know some of the common ideas. I think if they were a little bit more familiar with this opening, I think something I'd see way more often is c5, which is a bit more tactical, and d5, which is a bit more positional. I think both of those are, you know, the more mainline ways to continue. But castling is still a fine move, still follows opening principles, and by no means is it bad. It's still a good move. It's just less common, and kind of gets me thinking maybe they don't know this opening super deeply. So anyway, so the next move is here. I play knight to e2. And this is a really cool idea here. This is the Reshevsky variation, and it's one of the few lines, the Nimzo-Indian, where I try and avoid doubled pawns if possible. If they want to take now, I'll just recapture with the knight, and then I avoid doubled c-pawns. Now, you could also go back here, and you could play queen to c2 instead. That'd be the classical variation. It's so common. Everyone has this prepped at least like 8, 10 more moves deep, you know. So it's just something I don't really want to deal with. But I also may not want doubled pawns. And so I just play this move here, and, you know, the game will continue. And now my opponent plays knight to e4, which is kind of the first questionable move of the game, I think, even though I wasn't absolutely sure how to actually refute this in the game, because I've seen this so rarely. Quite frankly, I didn't really know exactly how to handle this. And maybe more evidence my opponent, you know, with the castling move, wasn't super booked up on this opening. Maybe they just know some of the key ideas, and they still get a playable game. So because this move is a bit unusual, I thought, well, can I play a3 and provoke them into capturing on c3, and then we trade a bunch on c3, and yes, I do get doubled pawns at the end of it, but I've provoked them into giving up the bishop pair. And I thought, you know, they've moved their knight again, so maybe it's sort of like a waste for them, because then they'll trade away both of their developed pieces. You know, so I thought maybe that's an okay move. And so I played a3, and it worked out alright in the game. But I think queen c2 might have actually been a better idea if I was really intent on keeping my pawns undoubled. And we'll actually see this a few moves a little bit later here, when I could have played queen c2 and how that actually would have worked. Because here I recapture, which is fine, and they capture, and then I go exactly as planned, I capture with the b pawn. But here's the queen c2 moment I wanted to mention, because this was like an automatic recapture. I didn't even consider anything else. Perhaps I should have, because actually, really interesting observation is I can play queen c2 here, and this still works, because the knight is actually trapped. You know, the knight cannot go back here because I'm now controlling this square. And the knight can also go to a4, can't go to b5, can't go deeper into my position. And basically the plan is if they do nothing, I'll just capture their knight and I've avoided my doubled pawns. Now, you might wonder, well, what if they go knight d5? Because then at least I have to give up a pawn, you know, when their knight escapes. And that's the only really testing move that you have in this interesting variation. But in this case, I just capture the knight, they take back, and then queen to f5 is really cool already, because, you know, it's already threatening to get back my pawn. If they defend it, well, I just develop bishop d3. I'm already threatening checkmate here. And so if they push like g6, well, then I just go back to f4. And although I'm down a pawn, I actually have some compensation, because black is the one with doubled pawns now, not white. Kind of strange, I usually have my doubled c pawns. Here it's black with doubled pawns, and I've also provoked the weakness at g6. And later in the game, we'll actually see how a move like g6 is actually key in how we actually attack positionally. And this is actually going to be something that we'll look at later on, as they do end up playing g6 at some point. And very similar to that, we'd exploit this in this variation, very similarly to what we did in the actual game. But okay, as the game went, you know, if I go back and show, when they captured here, I just automatically recaptured. Didn't give it perhaps as much thought as I could have, but I recaptured. And so now they play d6. And here's kind of maybe the key moment that kind of starts really the plans for each side, pretty much for the rest of the game. So now, in this moment, I want to explain something known as statics versus dynamics. And this is a very complicated subject, but what it comes down to is statics are more long-term things that can't really change too much, and dynamic is more short-term, that's a little bit more in fluctuation. And so how this applies here is specifically the weaknesses that I have. Right here I have doubled pawns. These pawns are a static weakness. It is not going anywhere. This is long-term. There's no way I can like undouble pawns that easily and keep this structure. And so these doubled pawns are probably going to be here for a while, possibly into the endgame. And if we get to an endgame, especially if it's a pawn endgame, I'm probably losing, because doubled pawns are not so great in the endgame. You know, I would much rather have, you know, this pawn back here on b2, but unfortunately I don't have that. And so my plan already is I really don't want to be playing some quiet stuff and trading very small positional things and then go into an endgame. Basically, if my attacks end, I'm just stuck with this weakness and they can attack it long term. And, you know, I have so many weak squares to my queen side. You know, this is a hole, this is a hole, this is a hole. These pawns can't be defended by friendly pawns, so they're all weak. You know, this square is also a hole. You know, so there's so many things here. It's not really so great, you know, positionally on my side. But, of course, this is thematic to the Nimzo-Indian, so why would I allow this? Well, I do have some compensation for it, so it's not all bad. Now, my advantage here is dynamic, the other side of static. It's the more short term. It's the I have to act here and now, and I have to act very quickly. So what is that dynamic advantage that I have? Well, in this case, I do have some really nice attacking lines on their king. Specifically, if I go bishop d3, already this is attacking their king. And maybe in some lines, I might even have the queen coming out here. That's also a nice attacking idea. Maybe long term, this bishop is actually going to play some role in the attack. So there's a lot of long term ideas that come up, you know, even though this is a dynamic advantage. Something that's very short term, like I have to get my pieces developed, I have to generate some attack, and maybe I can prolong it a little bit more long term, but if I delay it inevitably, then I'm going to just end up in a position where these doubled pawns are basically going to cost me the game. I'm going to end up losing. So here, if I was black, I think you have to play very slow and positional and try and gang up on these pawns and eventually win, you know, grind to an endgame, and you got the win. And if you're white, you really have to keep your foot on the gas pedal. You just have to keep, you know, provoking weaknesses, keep attacking, and this is how both sides are going to play the game from here on out. So with that being said, right away, I'm going to develop, and I play bishop d3. Immediately looking at their king side, and we're only move 9, and I'm already aggressively looking at ideas possibly for attack. So my opponent plays a really good move here. They strike in the center with c5, probably the best move here, because these doubled pawns, maybe I would have liked to advance it in some line and try and undouble it, but here I can't do that because they're blocking me. So this is a nice move by them, And right now, I'm also not worried at all if they take in the center, because that would actually be a mistake that would help me, because then I can, just undouble my pawns, help me get rid of my weakness. So I'm not really worried that they'll take here, but it's just the fact they're striking in the center and kind of provoking me into doing something. I probably don't want to take here. Tripled pawns, not really the most appealing look, but, maybe in some lines it might actually be playable. But here we continue as, we're, intending. We want to create weaknesses on their king, and we have to keep up the pressure and keep attacking. So I play queen to c2. And the idea with queen c2 is actually very straightforward. It's not just a random developing move. I'm specifically aiming at this pawn. And I'm pretty sure my opponent, over 2000, is definitely going to see this. They're not going to hang a pawn with check for nothing. But what I want is really them to push this pawn to h6. Or if they even push g6, that's also a win for me. And then f5 would also be a win for me, because all of those moves advance pawns in front of their king. Generally speaking, their castled king wants to keep these pawns, called home pawns, very close, right in front of their castled king, and that's going to offer them the best protection to try and defend their king. They castle because they want king safety. They don't want to be advancing these pawns that should basically be acting like their bodyguards and keeping close by. So here I'm basically provoking them to play h6, and that's exactly what we get. So they do play h6, and this is a small, I don't want to say advantage because it's so minuscule, but long term, yeah, maybe this is an advantage. Where, at least practically speaking, I might be able to exploit this pawn being pushed to h6. It's a very small advance, but it might mean a lot. I actually did a video on why you shouldn't be pushing pawns in front of your castled king, so I'll leave a link to that in the video description if you want to check it out, especially if you're a beginner. Those ideas can be very helpful to check out, but either you know those ideas or you'll check them out later. Just understand this is a weakness for the time being, and we'll continue with the game and see how we actually make use of this. So now I castle, because even though I'm attacking, I definitely can't neglect king safety. I have to, castle, use still good opening principles, and eventually get my pieces out, and then, basically the attack that I want. So now my opponent develops, which is a good move, knight c6, and this is actually kind of good for a bonus reason, which is kind of my plan here, I thought, was I really wanted to push e4, and then e5, and just kind of expand even more space, and then my, pawns here would be actually kind of pointing towards their king side. More aggressive pawn structure to try and attack. Generally speaking, you want to be attacking on the side that your central pawns are pointing. So if my central pawn chain is pointing this way at their king, probably is a little bit better pawn structure for me actually attacking their king. So that was kind of one idea that I had planned. Maybe my opponent knew that, maybe not, but whatever the case, this move takes that away, because now they're attacking d4 again, and I don't have time to play e4, because if I do that, well, now they capture, and I can't take back, because then I drop this pawn, and they're attacking my queen. And so I'm not going to give up a central pawn and let them attack my queen in the process. So I can't play e4 anymore. So now I have to think, well, how can I prepare to play e4? Or a better way of saying that is, how can I fix the problem of d4 not being defended? And so to fix that, I actually played a move I really like, in the game, which was rook to d1. And the idea is, I'm basically defending this pawn. I'm adding another attacker to this pawn. Long term, I will say one other benefit of rook d1, it's also on the same file as their queen. So maybe long term there might even be some tactics on their queen being on the same file as that. But okay, so that was what I played and kind of what I was thinking during the game. Now, I will say there was actually one really cool idea the computer had in post-game analysis that was, I'll just say, completely different. Maybe that's the best way of saying it. It was really counterintuitive to me. And it's very similar evaluation to rook d1. I wouldn't say it's that much better or even better at all. It's just very different. And so the different move was actually play pawn to f4. Apparently this is an interesting alternative that is also a fine move here. And this was very counterintuitive to me because, generally speaking, I want to keep my pawns near my king. And this entire diagonal is now weaker because I've advanced this f2 pawn up to f4. So generally speaking, that was not a move that appealed to me. And also, this e3 pawn is almost kind of backwards looking. It's not quite backwards because, it's not like they have a pawn here stopping me from advancing. But, it's not really a structure that I really love here, especially with my king. I'd much rather have my pawn back here on f2, helping defend my king. But this was a valid idea because it helps deter e5, and maybe long term I can get e4 and then f5. And I'm aggressively attacking their king yet again, but this way it's a first with pawns, kind of ripping open lines of attack, and then we just play our attack very similar to what we might actually do without f4. So that was a very different plan that we could have gone with. But I think my route was a little more positional and just kind of a little slower, but also a great move. So I played the rook d1, which is fine. And so I'm now kind of threatening to play my e3, e4 pawn advance. And my opponent plays queen f6, which basically stops my threat, because again, I can't push here, because they've added another potential piece to attack d4. And so maybe they saw this plan, maybe they didn't. I'm guessing they did, because this queen is kind of a strange location if it wasn't for attacking d4. So they probably did see it. But, you know, this is what we get so far. And I just want to improve all my pieces. Most people would think, well, let's get our bishop out and then let's connect our rooks, and we've completed development. And yeah, that's actually a pretty good idea for most people, especially if you're just following opening principles. It's probably not too bad. However, I don't really love bishop to d2. That seems a little passive, and I'm just kind of looking at my own pawns. Not really that great, I think. You might also argue bishop b2 is fine, and maybe long term you'll have pressure on their king this way. But I'm not really too keen on this either, because these pawns are really kind of blocking the path, you know, for this bishop if it was on b2. And especially the c3 pawn's probably not going anywhere anytime soon, because we've got c4 blocking it. You know, so again, my double pawns are actually kind of hurting me once again here. You know, structurally, it's not really my favorite position in this. However, I actually think my bishop is really developed on c1. Yeah, it's unmoved, but you can almost think of it as developed, because really, I think the ideal spot for it to be would be exactly where it's at. And this piece can maybe attack h6 long term once I push my pawn. So if my pawn goes up to e4, e5, this bishop is really good on c1 where it's at. So I actually don't want to move my bishop. So what else can I move? And so here I thought, well, let's actually play queen e2, which is a very patient move, I thought, but it's just bringing one piece a little bit closer to the king side. Maybe I can go to g4 or maybe even h5 in some lines. And the idea is I'm just inching closer and closer to their king and trying to get more pieces active. So if their king is undefended enough, maybe then my pieces can actually break through with some attack. So it's these small little improvement moves sometimes that can kind of help you attack in a more positional way. So now my opponent plays a pretty cool idea here. Oh, but before I show their move, their cool idea, I just want to show one other reason why I moved my queen to e2. The last reason why is because my goal is already served. Like here, the whole purpose of this battery was to provoke h6, and that was already played, so that was provoked. So I've kind of succeeded in the goal, so that also helps me free up the queen and move it to other goals, you know, later, because it's already provoked the move I was trying to go for. But okay, now let's go back to my opponent's really cool idea. Sometimes I get so excited to even show their ideas, because yeah, my opponent played it, but still a really cool concept. So their idea is to play knight a5. And this is a very common Nimzo-Indian structure here, because very often here you'll have these doubled c-pawns. And if you're black, a very common way to attack this is you put your knight on c6, you relocate it to a5, and then from there you're going to advance your pawn to b6, and you play bishop to a6. And now the knight is attacking c4 and the bishop is attacking c4. And so this is a really thematic idea in how you can add pressure to white's weakness, their doubled pawns here. So this is a really cool idea that they played, you know, understanding at least the basics and kind of the common patterns of this opening, even if perhaps they don't know really deep opening theory, you know, in that sense. So they play knight a5, which is a really clever idea, I thought. And so here I thought, well, can I really defend this pawn? At least for the time being, I anticipate them playing b6 and bishop to a6. So I actually drop back and I play bishop to c2, which just guards b3, because maybe in some lines, if my bishop was back here, remember b3 is a hole, and maybe they could have brought in their knight, maybe in some lines it would have been annoying. So I just drop back my bishop, and I have a plan, which we're about to see, for when they play their b6, which is exactly what they do. And so my plan, the move I was trying to play all along, was now I play pawn to e4. And they play bishop to a6, and as you can see from my clock here, I have 7 minutes and 58 seconds, and the next move I played in 1 second. I knew exactly what to play before they played this. I anticipated to sacrifice this pawn, because it's my doubled pawn, and so it really doesn't change that much, because it was my weakness anyway. And yeah, I don't want to be giving up pawns, but I didn't really see a great way of defending it. And by doing so, it's given me time to push e4, e5 that I wanted. And now, because of this push, I'm gaining a tempo on their queen, and more importantly, I've unleashed these amazing Horowitz bishops. My queen is also close to entering the attack, and you know, maybe even my rook on d1 might even do like a rook lift or something. You never know. I have so many ways to bring more pieces into the attack. So okay, so e5 was a move I really liked. So they do capture, they capture back, and now they have to move their queen, so they're going to play queen to h4, which was the best move, because again, it adds another attacker to c4, and it makes it really sure that they're going to have enough firepower to attack c4 and win that pawn. Now, how can I actually defend that? And the answer is, I don't think I can. So I thought, well, is there a way I can counterattack? Can I make a more forcing threat that's more important than them taking this pawn? And there is a forcing threat I can play. It's very forcing, in fact. But it's a bit positional and kind of what I'm going for. So I play queen to d3. And, of course, the very forcing threat is queen to h7 checkmate. So a checkmate in 1 is pretty forcing. I don't expect my opponent to fall for mate in 1. The idea, the positional gain that I have from this, is I'm provoking pawn to g6. And notice, this is the only move that saves it for them, because pretty much all other moves lose. Now, if they were to play f5, that doesn't solve anything, because then I can capture en passant, and I still have this queen check on h7. So either way, it looks like I'm attacking them. So the only move they can do to stop this breaking through is to play g6. That's like really the only defense they have. But this is what I wanted, because before they've pushed h6, now they've pushed g6. And with these small little pawn advances, this gradually, over time, slowly and slowly starts to weaken their king. And if their king is weak enough, I can actually make use of that, and I can actually attack it as I did in the game. So now, I feel like, well, this is great, this is what I want. Maybe even my bishops can attack there, maybe my queen. I just need to bring more and more attackers towards their king. And so I calculated, and I thought, well, how can I do that? And I looked at some options, and one move I looked at was queen to e4, and I'll show why I didn't play that. But for the time being, the main reason I thought was I don't really want to trade queens here, because whose king is safer? My king looks fairly safe. You know, my pawns are very nicely in front of my king. It looks pretty well guarded, and the only piece that they have near my king really is the one black queen, and that's probably not going to be able enough to checkmate me all by itself. So I feel like my king is fairly safe. Their king, on the other hand, these pawns are much more advanced, so their king is a bit more exposed, and if their king is more unsafe than mine, I probably want to keep the queens on the board, because both queens are potentially the best attacker. You know, they have the most attacking pressure in most positions. So with that being said, I wanted to keep queens on the board, and I thought, well, I'll play queen to f3, because it's once again, very similar to queen e2 from earlier. It's just a very small improvement move where I'm inching a little bit closer to the king side. Maybe I'll come to f6 in some lines. Maybe the bishop will capture an h6. You know, I have a lot of ideas that I'm kind of threatening all at once. Now, to show queen e4, this is a really cool thing, because I calculate this briefly, because sometimes, you know, a queen trade might be okay, even though it's not the most attacking. And it is kind of an interference that sort of stops their queen from aiming at my, you know, c4 pawn. But I rejected queen e4, even though the engine actually thinks this is the best move. Queen f3, according to them, is actually the second best. So I play the second best, but I didn't see the first best in why, because I actually miscalculated something here. So with queen e4, it's very counterintuitive for me to trade queens, because generally their king is weaker, and I want to keep queens on the board. But there's something very concrete that I get by trading queens in this very exact way. So if they were to capture the queen, and then I capture back with the bishop, I saw that I'm hitting the rook, so that's fine, and I figured they'd try and contest the open file. And so what I missed was all this I calculated was I thought, well, I'll trade rooks, they take back as well, and then I'll capture this pawn on h6. And I thought, well, great, okay, I'm up a pawn. But then I thought, well, they're going to capture on c4. And if they capture on c4 with the knight, material's just equal. And they're also attacking e5 with their knight. And I don't really want equal. You know, it seems like my attack is ended, and I don't really have that much. And worse, I've traded queens. So I feel like if my attack is ended, it's kind of an equal endgame. I don't really like my chances here. And so that's actually why I went with queen f3, thinking queen e4 actually wasn't best. Now remember, I said it's the best move. So what gives? What was the difference? The difference was I miscalculated here. Because although my assessment was right in that final position, I calculated for taking the rook here. Probably because it was attacked and I didn't want to get back rank checkmated. I kind of wanted to avoid that, so I just figured I'll trade rooks. But what I missed was I can play bishop captures h6 here. And now there's no back rank because I'll just recapture. And this saves everything because now I've won a pawn, but I'm also attacking their rook in the process. And so this is just a really cool idea where now if they trade, that's fine. because the rook is attacked, so they have to move the rook. They don't have time to grab c4 yet. And I have a really nice bishop here, and I have the open file. And so you put all those together, and at least for right now, I'm up a pawn. I think white would be really good here, at least a small advantage. And maybe that was why queen e4 was actually a good move. But for all those reasons, with me not seeing exactly in that way, I chose to keep the queen on the board. I played queen f3, which is the next best move. So now they take the pawn, which I sacrificed. And the reason I also did that, I mentioned earlier, it's my doubled pawn. So really, that doesn't change much, because remember I said when I had doubled pawns, here, this isn't really so great for me. And in the endgame, I know I'm probably going to lose because the doubled pawns might be bad enough that I might lose a pawn endgame. So the fact that I've actually lost this pawn and now I'm down by a full pawn, well, that just means I should avoid the endgame anyway. And so really, them winning the pawn hasn't really changed my game plan much. My game plan is still I want to keep attacking their king, and this pawn on the queen side doesn't really have anything to do with their attack, that they have to defend on the king side. So here I just played normally, and I thought I was probably still okay here. So I played pawn to g3, and this is actually a key moment, because they don't want to play queen to h5, because then I can just trade queens, and now they have doubled pawns. And in fact, it would actually be dropping this h-pawn, if they actually do it in that exact way. So maybe that's not really so great. So really, where can this queen go? And this is actually tough, because I thought a threat here was if they leave guard of this f6 square, I might have queen f6. And if I can play queen f6, then maybe I can take here, and I'm threatening checkmate on g7. So in my mind, and probably my opponents, they probably had to guard this f6 square. However, the engine actually prefers that they play queen to h3. They say that's the only move that's actually holding a minuscule advantage for black. Less than half a pawn, but at least they're holding. And the queen is not going to attack much by itself, but at least they're sort of holding the position. Whereas instead of that, my opponent played queen to e7, and the engine in the post-game analysis actually considered that move a blunder. And the reason why it's a blunder is for the move that I ended up playing in the game. Now, they probably thought it was fine because they had to guard the f6 square, but here the problem is I take on h6. And so I've won this pawn, which the queen on h3 would have defended, so that's kind of the big difference there. But material's equal, so you might think, well, what's the big deal? Because I was down a pawn, remember they captured on c4, and now I've got a pawn back. So material's equal, they just save the rook, right? And then it should be fine, like they just move here, fight for the open file, and maybe to the untrained eye, you might think that this is like just a, equalish position. But in the game, I knew I was already winning here. And if you let the engine run, it's actually cycling between like +3, +4 in the evaluation. But if we look at material is equal. Now, in the game, I didn't think I was winning by that much just because of this queen e7 move. In the game, I thought I was like maybe +1, +2. I thought it was a slight advantage. It's definitely better for me. But it just goes to show, really, how important, this position is for white and how good this is positionally, even though material is equal. I think if you were like a grandmaster or title player, this might even be resignable for black. But why is this position so good for white? I say it like it's such a decisive thing. Most beginners, maybe even intermediates, probably don't see why. And so there's one key idea here that's super important for me attacking. So I have a dark squared bishop. They don't. Now, yeah, they've given up the bishop here because they only have one bishop. I saw both. And that's a small detail, but it's especially the dark squared bishop. Even if this light squared bishop was off the board, it's the presence of this dark squared bishop that is so powerful. And so why is this such a powerful asset here? It's powerful because these pawns have pushed, and these pawns are on light squares. Right near their king, what they want is some kind of defense. And to put it bluntly, they have no way to defend their dark squares because they lack the dark squared bishop. Usually that's fianchetto on g7 here, to help defend some of these weak squares. But here, I'm just completely unopposed on that color complex. Really, the only piece that's anywhere nearby that can defend those squares is the queen. And, obviously my bishop is attacking, that queen has to move because it's of greater value. So already here, I think, because I have this dark squared bishop and their dark squares are weak, this is just a winning position already, just outright. Really, pretty much anything you do to keep the attacking pressure, pretty much white is going to win here, like every single time. Which is crazy, because I think for most people, you don't see that it's that big of a deal at this stage of the game. It looks like maybe it's an equal position, material's fine, and you move on. But on the contrary, white is actually a lot better here because of that weakness. And remember, all this was slowly built up. remember at the very beginning, way earlier, we played bishop to d3 back in the opening just to try and provoke the h6 move. And later we ended up provoking g6. And all these little things add up because as their pawns advanced, we provoke these weaknesses because of their pawns advancing. So, that's kind of what we do to attack positionally. But now we play pawn to h4, which we keep up the attack because again, we have to keep attacking, and maybe in some lines we'll even play h5. Now, what's really cool about this too is I'm also supporting bishop g5. So, maybe in some lines I'm either attacking the queen and material behind like the rook, or I might even swing to h6, and then I might like bring the queen in some other way, and then threaten checkmate here. So there's a lot of ideas that they kind of have to watch out for, even though I haven't really committed myself one way or the other. But now they, trade on d1, I take back, they play rook d8, I trade, and then they take back, and now it looks like this simplification might have helped black, and at the very least they've gained control of the open file now, which, they previously didn't have. However, just because they've given up, I've given up these potential attackers, doesn't mean my attack is ended, because they still have all these weak dark squares. That hasn't changed because the queens and rooks wasn't really, involved in these dark squares anyway. And so as long as they don't have counterplay against my king, which they don't, really nothing has changed when I traded here. Their simplification, put it pretty simply, doesn't actually help them too much. So here I have to keep attacking with the pieces I've left. And so I play pawn to h5. And I'm threatening to open up lines. If they, take back here, I'm already winning material. So I have to be very, very careful, on how they play this. So they play very actively, and they try and fight back with bishop to d5, attacking my queen. But now I can just patiently play queen g4, and now this pawn is actually pinned, so now they can no longer take here. So next, they played king to h7. And I think queen c7 was maybe a little bit better to try and defend, but it's still a losing position. It's still very difficult to try and defend here. But when they played king to h7, I thought, can they actually play this move? And I was already calculating for checkmate because their king is just kind of walking into the line of this bishop. And, there's so many ideas where maybe I could lure their king up. So this is where I started calculating. And so I calculated a little bit here. And the move I came up with, after a little thought, was I can actually capture on g6. And this is engine approved because before it was a mate in 5 that was forced, and this is the correct move to do this. But at this point when I took here, I actually had this calculated in my mind all the way to checkmate. I actually did see it correctly. The idea is that if they move their king somewhere, if they don't take my bishop, I can just capture this pawn here, and my attack continues because their king is so exposed here. They have no defenders. Their king is all alone. They're going to get checkmated very easily because their king is so vulnerable. So pretty much they have to take my bishop. That's like the only try that they can try to hold on. But now I play queen to h3 check. Now I don't want to play here this check because then they can trade queens and I've got nothing. So I don't want to be trading queens. They're up material. But I play this check, so now their king has to go back. Now you might wonder what happens if their king comes up to g5. I calculated that. That's just checkmate in 1. This pawn is defended by the bishop, and this also controls this square here. And the queen controls the rest, so that's a checkmate. Pretty simple. f4 was also a checkmate. I didn't see that one in the game. I just saw queen to h4. But that's also a checkmate in 1, equally similar. But here, what if they go back to g7? And so this is the better try, I think. And here, I just play queen h7 check. They're forced their king over, and then queen f7 is checkmate. And so it seemed like very quickly their king, ended up losing the game with checkmate. But really had to do with those dark squares. Unfortunately, I don't think there was really much there. Like, I think my opponent really did the best he could to defend. There isn't really much he could have improved on at that point. It was just a really bad position to begin with because he had these unopposed weak dark squares that he had to deal with, and I had the dark square bishop. So because of that fact, I was able to generate this attack. And so whenever you're thinking of how you can attack, oftentimes it's not just these sparkling sacrifices and these huge amazing tactics, that come up out of nowhere. Sometimes those do happen, but they come up from very small positional things grown over the course of the game. And in this case, we saw some of those positional things that kind of led to this attack. Mainly, we were understanding that we couldn't play slow because we had the doubled pawns here on the c-file, and we had to keep attacking their king. So we kind of understood the position well enough to know we had to attack. And then we just found ways to slowly bring pieces towards their king, and then eventually find ways to force weaknesses because of that, where they had to advance pawns to try and hold their king. But in advancing the pawns, they create positional weaknesses like the dark squares that we could actually take advantage of. And so that's kind of how you win chess games at the higher level sometimes. You have to kind of understand the position and sometimes turn those positional things into an attack. So I hope that was an instructional game for everyone. I thought it was. And I thought it was a really good example, especially in how you can illustrate just the power of an unopposed color complex. So make sure to keep your king safe, everyone. Make sure to keep your pawns close to your king for the most part so you don't advance those pawns and create similar weaknesses to your own king. So thanks for stopping by, everyone. I'll see you in the next chess video.